Uncle Paulie, Big Diddy, Caesar Leo, De Janeiro, Charlie Baltimore, Iceberg Slim, the most shady, Frankie Baby. We here.
Do you know what beef is? Do you know what beef is?
In 1953, in fact, the CIA secretly sponsored its first full-scale coup in Iran, and as a result, the USA kept control of one of the largest oil producers in the world.
Iran was important for two reasons. It had oil and it had a 1,000-mile border with the Soviet Union, now Russia. The CIA wanted access to the border so they could spy on the Soviets and they could put their missiles there. The British, who were deeply involved in this intelligence coup in Iran, we wanted access to Iranian oil. So between us, we quite deliberately and viciously overthrew the Prime Minister, Mr. Mossadegh.
In 1951, Prime Minister Mossadegh became Iran's first democratically elected leader. His first act in power was to nationalize Iran's oil industry, and his second was to begin talks with Iran's Soviet neighbors. Talking to the Soviets and taking back the oil industry might have been popular with the Iranians, but it certainly wasn't popular with the CIA.
What the British and the Americans managed to get terribly wrong was that they thought that Mossadegh was a communist. And that's why they were so fearful about him. They thought that somebody else could come in through the back door into Iran and take over.
Today, the greatest threat to peace is the expansionist aims of the Kremlin. Freedom everywhere. Our freedom is in jeopardy.
In April 1953, Alan Dulles, the CIA director, secretly set aside $1 million to get rid of Mossadegh by any means possible.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I'm Michael Brooks. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA, where left is best. Greetings to comrades, friends, and enemies. With me, as always, is super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Head theoretician David Grishcom.
How's it going?
Pretty well. We got to get you connected to the printer system, dude. And of course, super producer David Slavic. He is roaming the Digitosphere, Twitter, Discord, and everywhere else in the growing TMBS universe. On this week's program, Glenn Greenwald. He is the co-founding editor of The Intercept. He's also a columnist. We're talking about the coup in Brazil, how a right-wing political formation removed a democratically elected president from office, imprisoned one of the globe's most popular politicians, and a paramilitary assassination of a leading rights advocate and up-and-coming politician in the country. The bigger context, the bigger story of what's happening there, plus his reaction to the almost certain to be confirmed torturer as the next head of the CIA, as well as the disastrous destruction of the Iran deal. And Julia Salazar, she is a candidate, DSA-backed candidate in New York's 18th district, running on the Democratic primary on a Democratic socialist line. We're talking about her background in union organizing, what brought her to socialism, and the left electoral project. Plus, we have a shout out to Grandpa Bernie. He's doing more dope stuff. And I think you already know who is in this week's Gulag. A ultra mediocre Times columnist who I really absolutely would put in a Gulag. That is not a joke. I am absolutely into not only shutting down her ideas, such as they are, but in an ideal world, really just actually her. Everything she represents. All this and more on this week's TMBS as we wage the war against the open and free exchange of ideas. as we do every week. But first, President Trump has withdrawn from the Iran deal, the preeminent diplomatic accomplishment of modern politics, a deal that was specifically narrowly tailored to deal with Iran's nuclear program, that brought together stakeholders, European, United States, as well, obviously with support from Russia and China, P5+1. This deal has been working. It's been recertified by the IAEA. It was recertified by the Obama administration, by Trump's State Department under its previous leadership under Rex Tillerson. This deal is not about ICBMs. It's not about Hezbollah. It's not about any additional broader strategic issue. It was one specific area, and it was working. And this is a disastrous move from the perspective of the security and well-being of the globe, the potential for war, as well as finally, in this case, because this is an overused cliche in journalist and global political discourse, but it actually does jeopardize the credibility of the United States in a way that's actually real and not made up. We're going to start with a couple of reactions. First, this is a report from CBS News of President Obama's official response to this, and then we will go to Iran, where President Rouhani has responded to this reckless and stupid move as well.
Former President Obama says pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal is, quote, a serious mistake. In a statement, Mr. Obama said walking away from the JCPOA turns our back on America's closest allies and an agreement that our country's leading diplomats, scientists, and intelligence professionals negotiated. He continued, the consistent flouting of agreements that our country is a party to risks eroding America's credibility and puts us at odds with the world's major powers.
Now, President Rouhani in Iran responding to the news as well. And actually, Iran committing itself to remain in the agreement in spite of the U.S. violation.
They have done nothing except put empty signatures on pieces of paper without doing anything about it. The Iranian mission, on the other hand, has agreed to everything and accomplished all its responsibilities. We had some duties based on that agreement, and we have delivered all of them. But today we can see which is the country that doesn't respect international agreements. We have done nothing wrong. It is not acceptable that the US is pulling out.
Rouhani championed the nuclear agreement in the face of hardline critics at home, who said it was unlikely to succeed. So despite the U.S. pullout, Rouhani isn't willing to give it up without a fight.
So Javad Zarif, Rouhani's foreign minister who's instrumental in negotiating the deal, is attempting to coordinate with the Europeans that are still in the deal who have decried this move in an attempt to save it. Now, there's a couple of things that will come out of this really briefly. The Europeans will be threatened economically by reimposed sanctions because there were secondary sanctions from the ones that the Trump administration is going to reimpose now, along with them reneging and attempting to blow up this deal, which could in fact jeopardize European companies doing business in Iran. But the broader effects of this deal have been less specifically economic. In fact, in some ways, Rouhani has oversold, arguably, the economic benefits for Iranians. The Iranian economy is still very unequal and very stagnant, and we saw labor unrest there several months ago. So that's an ongoing issue regardless of the agreement. What, of course, this agreement has done has been a tremendous step forward for international security and safety and rationality in the global system. So there might be a way in which inspections will continue. Iran will continue to live up to its agreements, and they'll continue to coordinate with the Europeans and, of course, continue to open up and deepen trade with China and Russia, as an example. Regardless, Israel wants to blow this agreement up, potentially in the worst case scenario, because there is a massive appetite for war amongst members of the Trump administration and the Netanyahu team. It would serve as a great distraction from other infractions across the world, including, of course, the Israeli occupation and ongoing siege of Gaza. And it would be an aggressive attempt to reset the tables in a regional conflict which the Saudis and the Israelis perceive the Iranians as winning. And that tells a lot of the backstory behind some of both Israeli and Saudi moves in Syria, and certainly the ongoing massive humanitarian crimes that occur on a daily basis with US and UK support in Yemen. There's also the angle here of, frankly, fulfilling the desires and excitement and wishes of deranged campaign contributors. Sheldon Adelson is going to need to open his coffers up in what are looking like very tough midterms for Republicans. And I want to just give you another sense here. I don't know how many more lessons people need to have that just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you're not deranged, insane, delusional, dangerous, have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and have toxic and terrifying ideas that are a threat to the well-being of the entire globe. This is Sheldon Adelson. In 2013, he was talking with the silly celebrity rabbi and Cory Booker, he better not be your friend anymore, Shmuley Boteach, a truly odious and ridiculous presence in American life. And he proposed what he would do about Iran. This is a multi-billionaire and one of the most important Republican kingmakers and Middle East influencers on the globe.
I think it's the worst negotiating ploy tactic anybody could imagine.
Right, so you would support negotiations with Iran currently so long as they first seized all enrichment of uranium?
No. What do you mean support negotiation? What are we going to negotiate about? What I would say is, listen, you see that desert out there? I want to show you something. See, pick up your cell phone, even at traveling rates. You pick up your cell phone, and what do they call them?
Roaming charges.
Roaming charges. You pick up your cell phone and you call somewhere in Nebraska and you say, okay, let it go. So there's an atomic weapon goes over ballistic missiles in the middle of the desert that doesn't hurt a soul. Maybe a couple of rattlesnakes and scorpions or whatever. And then you say, see, the next one is in the middle of Tehran. So we mean business. You want to be wiped out? Go ahead and take a tough position and continue with your nuclear development. You want to be peaceful? You want to be peaceful? Just reverse it all, and we will guarantee you that you can have a nuclear power plant for electricity purposes.
So a tremendous demonstration of American strength, so that they would get the message.
The only thing they understand.
And do you see the current negotiations as a demonstration of weakness?
Absolutely.
So let's tease that apart. And again, I remind you, that's not a crazy old man on the subway. Okay, that's not one of my uncles trying to show me a picture of their kid's first Little League practice and then saying, hey, you're involved in politics. What about this idea? What if we dropped a nuke on the unoccupied part of the Iranian desert that didn't hurt anybody? And then we use it as a jumping off point to threaten genocide if they didn't give up their nuclear program, which incidentally, you just said at the end, could be used to generate electricity, which is actually entirely the point because all the technology is dual use. And that's the whole point of the agreement, that it could be used for civilian purposes with strict oversight, all of which have been recertified and reconfirmed by all credible international bodies. That is the mind. That is the thought process that is directing Israeli and American foreign policy making. And I doubt very much that any other frontline Republican would have done any different. They all campaigned against this deal. This has been a major agenda of the political side of the Israeli right, not the Israeli defense and intelligence establishment, which does have more rationality on this issue. So there's three things out of this. Yes, this could lead to war, which would be beyond catastrophic. More likely, it will be more contained and focused in a way that is just on the sort of project that Derek Davidson and I talked about on last week's Illicit History for patrons, of the process of not, quote unquote, normalizing Iran and keeping them outside of potential broader regional diplomatic solutions from everything from Syria to Lebanon to Yemen, all of these flashpoints. And three, while I have a lot of cynicism about sort of hashtag activism in some respects, I think that this is quite important, that in a place like Iran, where, of course, the right now will be ascendant and having a great victory, and the supreme leaders profess cynicism at the outset of these negotiations several years ago, is unfortunately being vindicated by these grotesque morons that run the United States right now. It is actually important that everything from the statement to President Obama to even people's sort of social media feedback actually registers that normal people inside the United States are not stupid. They support this deal, and they want to somehow pull back slightly from the brink. And here's another litmus test for Democratic candidates in 18 and certainly 2020. What are you going to do to save, or not save, restore, or generate something new here? Because this is a major catastrophe that actually is a crisis that has been generated by these thugs and fools that run this administration. All right. Let's get to the shout out. DJ Danarchy. Oh, you know what? Two-part brief shout out. Let me just say, Julia Salazar and I, along with Jamie Peck and a couple of others, are going to be doing and I have to get this up on my phone, very professional. We are doing a healthcare symposium for the DSA in Brooklyn this Saturday. It is May 12th, the DSA Healthcare Community Fair. It's going to be from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., and we are doing a panel discussion. You can look up the event on Facebook and, of course, tweet any of us about it, and we will promote it more when Julia is on. So if you want to meet any of us and also learn not only from the panel discussion, there's also actually a lot of practical, actionable steps on how to access the healthcare you need. There's a bunch of kind of community interaction. It's up on screen now. DSA Community Health Care. And now the shout out goes to Bernie Sanders as we maintain our Birdie Bro brand here on TMBS. Bernie Sanders has just announced the Workplace Democracy Act and has gotten co-sponsors Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Kirsten Gillibrand, and 10 other Democrats. It would make it easier for workers to organize. The bill would allow for employees to form a union by a majority sign-up process rather than an election, which would also make the union-busting tactics and strategies of private companies that corporations use to attack unions much harder to implement. It requires companies to negotiate with a new union within 10 days of receiving a request. It mandates that workers in every state pay some dues to unions that represent them, and expands the law's definition of employers, a hotly debated term, of course, in the contract economy, which we're going to need to address urgently. Obviously, Bernie's always been great on these issues, and we should take yes for an answer. It's great to see center-right Democrats who don't have great histories on these issues jumping on board as Bernie sets the agenda for the actual policy blueprint that we need to deal with the defining crises of our time. And as I talked about last week in May Day, there's no democracy without unions. There's no left without unions. And there's no solution to all of the crises we face, from corporate monopolies to extreme inequality, without union power. So, shout out to Bernie. And what does everybody think of the new set?
You mean us, the producers?
Yeah. I can't. I'm not. No one else is in the room.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you're just throwing that out for people to comment on.
Well, maybe I'll throw it out in the post game. Although I'm kind of loath to do. There's a certain type of person that I think they're just unsettled by change. So I almost would want to wait like a week or two to let it kind of sink in, and then people could. But we've been looking at this for a little while already. Actually, we assembled this thing incredibly quickly. It's insane. It only took us 2 days to do this. What do you guys think?
The desks are looking a little too clean. We need a little more books and
a little more book.
Some like coffee mug stains.
Grisham with some very theoretician response to the new setup. Looking a little too CNN, a little too.
I don't know if you guys
too
like
crisp for Grisham.
But if I get new shoes, I don't feel comfortable in them
until a little scuffed up.
Yeah.
Right. Do you get 2 pairs and have a scuffed pair and a fresh to death pair?
No, I don't have anything fresh to death.
Matt Leck, I don't have anything fresh to death. All right, let's do a little fresh to death pitch, and then we'll be back with the great Glenn Greenwald. Yes. It is insane how the whole Dipset catalog just holds up and up and up and up.
This song sounds like if you sampled a bunch of like Edward Scissorhands stuff and then made a beat out of it.
And then just made like a ruthless beat out of it. And this doesn't have, but in the real song, in the non-instrumental with the girls just going ow. It's one of the best.
Early 2000s music production would have been pretty awesome.
No, it really, really would have been. Guys, we continue to grow. We had a little bit of a hiccup coming out of April, and it's nothing major. The rate is still extraordinary, but our goal is to get up to 2,000 patrons during the month of August. It's my birthday month, and it will also be the year-long anniversary of the show, so we can continue to push out and expand what we do and sustain the many things that we already have. We have some new reading from Marx, Non-Reformist Reforms, on the reading group. We have a brand new illicit history on Iranian alarmism, the roots of these lies and narratives that are actually helping, of course, form the crisis and the decision that we're in today. There's monthly phone calls for 21 and above patrons, for Comrade Above with David Slavic and myself, where we do everything from take your questions to do specific targeted activism and strategy calls. And another thing that is just starting, Waz and I, don't worry, he'll still be regularly on the show. He's crew. We have our own show now, which is going to be happening probably a couple of times a month. And it's going to be just for TMBS patrons and just for our brothers over at Count the Dings Patreons. And guess what? The first one is done. We went deep. There were laughs, there were arguments, and of course the other super producer, the very evil, the very genius Jade Hoyd, is flipping the dials on that one. That's coming out for patrons tomorrow. So, and then this weekend there's going to be a geostrategy brief out of Iran with crew Gene Bajlan, plus one we just banked with Brian Dimmitt from the Discord community on an amazing piece of activism for home care rights and access that has emerged organically out of the TMBS Discord community. We're incredibly proud. We're moving fast, and it's time to join. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. I wish the girl was here now to say ow. Maybe we could find another version of the instrumental. But again, we appreciate all of you, and we will be right back with Glenn Greenwald. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Next time I will ask Glenn if he's a Dipset fan. I'll save that for our second interview. But joining us now, and it is an honor to have him, is Glenn Greenwald. He's a co-founding editor and columnist for The Intercept. Glenn, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Glenn, I've talked a bit about Brazil on this show, and it has been from a couple of different frames. I mean, one is my perception that this is essentially a soft and potentially not so soft far-right coup with regards to Dilma and Lula, but that there's also much broader, far-reaching consequences for the country, even beyond those two sort of obvious focal points. And also the danger that could be read out of it on a number of levels, including the fact that actually, in fact, Lula and Dilma were quite centrist and conciliatory and sort of win-win in their politics, and still generated this massive reactionary response. I want you to talk about that, but what I would like you to start us off with is just the sort of actual legal realities of Lula's case and where this investigation comes from and what actually has and has not been proven, and broader implications for the entire Brazilian political class.
So, like everything in Brazil, including everything you asked me about, Lula's general criminal cases are really complicated. But the most ironic part about what has happened is that the case that has resulted in his conviction and now his imprisonment was always considered to be actually really frivolous and trivial in the broader context of what was claimed about him. Obviously the corruption scandal grows out of the fact that, unlike in a lot of countries where you have isolated corrupt politicians, Brazil is basically governed by systemic corruption. The whole government is basically just an organized crime ring, and PT being in control of that more or less for the last 16 years is certainly implicated in a lot of it. And Lula himself, when I interviewed him, said as much. So there's a lot of questions about the extent to which Lula was involved in this corruption ring involving Petrobras and the things you've heard about. This case, though, the one that has resulted in his conviction, has almost nothing to do with that. It instead alleges that there was a triplex apartment that, although he didn't formally or legally own, Lula was essentially the effective owner of, that they basically gave it to him in all ways except legally, that it was there for his use, and that one of the construction giants in Brazil did massive renovations on it in exchange for him helping them get contracts from Petrobras. And it has, from the surface, looked to be a standard legal case where due process is accorded. A judge, the main corruption judge, Sergio Moro, convicted him. There's no jury trial. He found him guilty, and it has now been appealed, and the appellate court unanimously upheld the conviction and actually increased the prison sentence from 11 to 12 years. And then the Supreme Court, in a 6-5 vote, denied him habeas corpus rights to be freed pending his appeal to that Supreme Court. So it's kind of checked off all the boxes in terms of the process so that people can say, oh, this isn't a coup, we followed the law, much like they did with Dilma. The reality, though, is the case is extremely dubious for all kinds of reasons. The main one being that there's just no evidence that this was actually Lula's triplex, that he ever received anything of value. And probably the worst part of it, just legally and procedurally, is that this judge in charge of what's called the Lava Jato, or car wash investigation, is supposed to be investigating everything relating to Petrobras, and this case doesn't really have anything to do with that. He kind of just took it based on what is a widespread and I think valid perception that he kind of made imprisoning Lula his religion or his fixation, and used this case that should never have even been before him in order to do it.
And also in the sense that this, as you said, if you opened up a sprawling investigation into Brazilian corruption, it would be, that obviously definitionally would implicate every single political party and also the current acting president. I mean, if you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not somebody who's going to sit here and say that I think Lula is innocent of corruption.
Right.
as I said, his party is definitely involved in corruption, and he was the head of his party. And if it turns out that there's evidence that Lula was involved in corruption, notwithstanding my admiration for him politically and personally, I think he ought to go to jail like everybody else. The problem is that hasn't been proven. There is a massive investigation, and what is impressive about what has happened in Brazil, notwithstanding what else one might say about it, is that the most powerful people in the country, billionaires and oligarchs and many leaders of parties from across the spectrum, have gone to prison. And as an American who watched the most powerful people be immunized after the torture regime in Iraq and the financial collapse of 2008, that's something that's a good thing, right? In a country that has traditionally protected its rich and powerful. Just it's good to see that happening. The problem is that it has been applied unequally. The current president of Brazil, Michel Temer, who was installed after Dilma was impeached, who never could have gotten elected on his own. He was elected as Dilma's vice president, but never would have gotten elected himself to this office, and has served the interest of oligarchs, even though the country voted for the leftish agenda of PT. He was installed in the name of fighting corruption, and yet he got caught on tape ordering bribe payments to some of the most corrupt politicians in Latin America to ensure their silence. His top aide got caught carrying suitcases full of cash. He's just a pure criminal. And the problem is that as long as you are in office, you have a privilege, a legal privilege against being prosecuted. And so Lula wasn't in office. Right. Occasionally they've taken out people out of office in order to prosecute them. But it's created this perception where leftist politicians have been put in prison and clearly corrupt politicians on the right have not. And that's the reason why this all looks so disturbing.
What are Lula's current conditions now?
So I think he's being treated reasonably well, given that he's an actual prisoner convicted of felonies. And I think most people regard that as true. I think he has not yet been put into an actual prison population. He's being kept in sort of this special room. They've had members of his party who have been able to visit him, though they're starting to now curtail those kind of visits and his contact with the outside world, making it increasingly difficult to know. But I don't think there's been any credible claims that he's been treated in any sort of particularly abusive way. If anything, he's probably gotten some special treatment as a result of his status.
I have a question, and then we'll pivot a little bit. But it's really striking to me. I mean, there's a question about the Brazilian media, which I'd like you to educate us on, because the perception that I have is that it's almost a sort of incredibly aggressive right-wing bloc, and that ironically one of the sort of more deeper structural reforms that PT didn't take on was some of the sort of media issues that maybe it could have addressed when it was in power. But it also strikes me that from an American United States media perspective, that when Lula first came on the scene, and Lula was covered as he's this reformed radical, and now he's willing to play ball with the World Bank and govern responsibly and so on and so forth. And that was true, in fact. But it also was like part of him maturing, quote unquote, politically and dealing with the system as it was precisely the kind of arrangements and potentially not even personally corrupt dealings, but making deals with corrupt parties, making peace with Brazilian corruption so as to get into power and actually deliver social good, which they did do. And it was covered here as, political maturation, and now it's corruption. I don't know if those kind of two narratives make sense to you, but it just always struck me as so kind of like funny that you could say, oh, yeah, sure, Lula's matured. He's willing to enter into kind of fully make deals and make peace with a fundamentally, corrupted system and then deliver. But, how we cover that and measure that depending on, the time of day here really radically shifts. I guess I gave you a two-parter there. Maybe you could start with the Brazil part and then get to the U.S. part.
These are really hard questions, and I've gotten some, personal insight into them because my husband is now an elected official in Brazil.
Right.
He ran for the city council in 2016 and won, and now is running for the federal Congress. And he's with this party called PSOL, the party of socialism and liberty, that essentially was founded during Lula's second term by disgruntled PTistas who left the party in protest of the neoliberalism and kind of compromises with oligarchs that you just alluded to, in order to be this, much more left-wing kind of pure party that wasn't going to be in bed with the corrupt parties and the corrupt oligarchs. And for a while, they were this outside party, which is easy to maintain this pure posture, right? Because you're not looking to govern. You're looking to kind of throw rocks and get some representation. And now with the collapse of PT, they're starting to actually have a real chance to govern. And so they're constantly faced with, and I see it from the inside, exactly that question, right? What compromises do you make so that you actually gain power, which in politics has to be the goal. Otherwise, it's just self-indulgent.
Right. It's just performance art nonsense. We got to deliver for people.
Yeah, right. You cannot take the position that, you don't care about actually obtaining power. So you need to make compromises. But then where do you draw the line where your compromises don't become strategic compromises, but actually start compromising the integrity of who you are and what you are?
Right.
And those lines are really blurry. They are not bright, and they're hard to decide. And one of the things that happens is the more you justify those compromises, the easier they are to make. And the more you make of them, the more you kind of become compromised yourself. And I think that really is the trajectory of Lula and PT. He began as a firebrand labor leader, no question about the authenticity of his ideology because of where he came from and what he devoted his life to. Same with Dilma. She went to prison because she took up arms as a communist guerrilla against the military dictatorship. And yet you make compromises and you make compromises and you make compromises, and suddenly you're this kind of centrist Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama kind of party, and no longer this real left-wing socialist party. And you're right, Lula was widely celebrated both in Brazil by its oligarchical media that you referenced. The oligarchs of Brazil got very comfortable with Lula. They were perfectly fine with how he was governing. They were making tons of money, even though there were some crumbs being thrown to people in poverty, or sometimes even more than just crumbs. I mean, he did bring a lot of people out of poverty, but the vast bulk of the improvements and the growth went to the wealthiest. They got way, way richer, and they were perfectly fine with those social programs because it wasn't really anything redistributive.
Right.
And then the minute, things kind of go wrong with the economy, which is the real reason why Dilma was impeached, not because the banks or anyone else grew uncomfortable with her or thought she was some leftist, but because their country was just being mismanaged economically, and it was their opportunity to finally get rid of PT and put in someone really devoted to the agenda of international capital and austerity and the like, which was Michel Temer. Then it kind of got rewritten, this history, and it was no longer, as you pointed out astutely, Lula has matured as a politician or become moderate. It was, oh, look, he himself was actually part of this corruption ring that they kind of forced him to become a part of in exchange for no longer depicting him as this person too radical to govern.
Really briefly, because then we have in some ways really a more important or central story to all of this that we're going to get to in a second that you're personally connected to. But Lula was leading, and I believe Dilma said herself several years ago that this doesn't end with my impeachment. The next step is ensuring that Lula can't run, and Lula was leading in the opinion polls. What is on tap? Because part of one of the candidates that I understand who is a leading contender is, and maybe it's another debate. I don't really have a problem calling Trump a fascist, and he's certainly a right-wing authoritarian. But this guy's like actually a fascist in like a textbook sense, as far as I understand.
Yeah. So, again, so whatever you think of PT, the reality is that they removed the democratically elected president, who was Dilma Rousseff, under, just the shoddiest, most dubious claims. And she was surrounded by actual criminals who voted for her impeachment. So they took her out, and then they took the person who was leading in the polls and almost certain to win, which was Lula, and made him ineligible to run by putting him in prison. So there's certainly a very strong anti-democratic result, even if that wasn't the intent, and it was almost certainly the intent. The problem that we now have is that the entire country has lost complete faith in the political class as a whole, not in any one ideology or any party, but in just political elites in general, because they've seen how the whole system is corrupt, and they blame the political class, which means that anybody who can stand outside the political class and rail against the establishment credibly is somebody who is going to have a lot of appeal.
That's the global pattern. Yeah.
That's the reason that Brexit passed in the UK, not because people were too stupid to understand its implications, but because they so hated the political establishment that anything the political establishment hated, they were willing to do. It's certainly the reason that first Obama won and then Trump won, and why a lot of people voted for each of them, despite their conflicting ideologies. It was this kind of outsider appeal. You hate the establishment, I'm going to change it and burn it down. And this is the worry about the actually fascist candidate. Jair Bolsonaro is his name. He was in the Brazilian military when there was an actual military dictatorship that only ended 32 years ago in 1985, which means that, a huge portion of the population lived under dictatorship. A lot of them are craving a return to it in light of all the problems with security and economic instability. And he's somebody who actually favors an end to democracy. Right. And the concern is that although he was unthinkable a year ago, and although there is a right-wing media here, they actually hate Bolsonaro for the same reason that a lot of right-wing institutions in the U.S. hated Trump, because he brings instability and uncertainty and kind of embarrasses the system. They're not behind Bolsonaro at all. They hate Bolsonaro, but it may not matter. And the other problem is that the left hasn't been able to unite behind anybody yet, now that, Lula's elimination is still pretty new. So I think there's a real chance that this actually fascist candidate who favors torture and praises the military dictatorship and just says the worst things about every minority explicitly, I'm not going to predict that he's going to win, but it's certainly a more than trivial possibility.
We're going to play a piece of sound now to get to a very, very... an important story in so many levels, partially actually because you're talking about somebody who, was assassinated, and actually somebody who is a very admirable and relevant and important person, I think, for anybody with a certain commitment to a type of democratic and socialist and justice-oriented politics. And that is Marielle Franco, who's a city councilor in Rio de Janeiro, that you are personally connected to, and you'll explain that in a moment. But this was an interview with President Lula that Amy Goodman did right before, I think within a week, actually, of his being sent to prison. And he spoke on this assassination, and though there were obviously some political differences, he was, forthright on, the fact that her killing was premeditated, and alluded to who might be behind it. And then I'll go to you to elaborate and explain her in the context. This is President Lula with Amy Goodman in March.
Amy, nós temos dois problemas no...
Amy, we have two problems in Brazil.
Aceitável.
The first,
o assassinato da Marielle,
is that her assassination is unacceptable. The assassination of Marielle, a young woman.
A única coisa que ela fazia,
the only thing that she did was to work against the assassinations of black persons in the peripheral areas, in the defense of human rights, in the defense of the lives of people.
Está claro que a morte dela...
It's clear that her death was a premeditated killing.
Milícia ou se foi polícia?
Now, I don't know if it was a militia or a police, but what is clear is that it is unacceptable, and that all of us Brazilians should come together in a single voice and shout out loud to immediately demand
dos responsáveis dessa chacina.
Punishment of those responsible for that killing.
Glenn, please respond to all that.
I mean, so it's really hard to put into words how special Marielle was, and her death has resonated not just around Brazil, but around the world in an amazing way that I don't think her killers anticipated. Yeah. And that's because in this country, which, is the fifth most populous country on the planet, it's a country of 260 million people that has had nothing or virtually nothing but hideous, horrible news and reasons for terrible pessimism. she was this remarkable, like, bright light, one of the few, like this repository of hope for people, you know, a black woman raised in one of Rio's worst and most violent favelas, a single mother at 19 who went and got her master's degree and then worked for 10 years and became an expert in criminality and sociology in Brazil, worked against investigating the militias, which are like these mafia-like organizations tied to the police and the military. She was an outspoken lesbian. And then the first time she runs for city council, which was when my husband, David Miranda, also ran in 2016 on the same party, she became the 5th highest vote getter in the entire city. 51 people are elected. She had almost 50,000 votes, which is unheard of for a political newcomer, especially a black woman from Mare, which is the favela that she was from. And it wasn't just all that, but she was incredibly brave and charismatic. She confronted with remarkable bravery the most corrupt factions in Rio. As Lula said, she campaigned against the targeting of black youth in the favelas who are systematically murdered by the police. But also, you know, just her personality was just so powerful and strong and defiant in a country in which white, rich men have ruled forever, that just her mere presence was revolutionary and subversive. You know, she was my husband's best friend. They worked side by side in the city council. She spent a lot of time at our house. We were so happy that our kids who are adopted got to have her as a role model. And just yesterday, there was a huge break in the case, which is O Globo, which is the largest newspaper in Rio de Janeiro, reported that a witness who worked for the militias went to the police and said that the person who ordered her murder was one of the fellow members on the city council who is a known member of the militia, who worked with one of the militia chiefs, a former police officer who's now in prison, and ordered her murdered because he felt threatened by her activism, that she was organizing the favelas where he rules and where his vote comes from, and that he felt very personally threatened by her. And I think, you know, as Lula said early on, it was either the police or the militias. I think everyone now knows it's the militias, and it's increasingly appearing that the order to kill her originated with elected members of the same legislative body on which she served.
Is this the type of thing where ultimately to deal with and bring justice for her killers, that the kind of, you know, broader crisis of Brazil needs to be addressed?
Well, interestingly, I mean, this week my husband David is in the Dominican Republic with Marielle's wife, her widow, at the Organization of American States, demanding an international commission to oversee the investigation on the grounds that the police forces in Brazil are so corrupted that they can't possibly be trusted to investigate essentially themselves. But the reason why it has become so crucial that Marielle's killers be apprehended, and not just the people who pulled the trigger, but those who ordered them to do it, is because the killing was carried out with such remarkable, chilling professionalism and competence that it's obvious that they were linked to the military or the police. Right. And the idea that somebody could just extinguish her life with impunity would send a signal about this country that would be incredibly dark and depressing. And so I don't think that even Brazil can tolerate allowing this to go with impunity, which is why you're starting to see some progress being made in trying to find her killers.
We will definitely, I've talked about it a little bit before on this show, but we'll definitely stay tight on that story. There's a couple more things I do just want to touch on you with while we have your time. You know, I did the opening segment tonight, and also the cold open drew our attention back to 1953 and the coup that overthrew Mossadegh. I think, you know, in moments am an Obama defender, and the Iran deal was probably the high point of any Obama defense that I could mount. I don't know. I just find this incredibly depressing and dangerous. I don't necessarily know that it means war, by the way. But it is really devastating.
I mean, I think the overall context is that there is this realignment taking place in the Middle East, where in a really remarkable development that's not discussed very much, Israel's closest allies in the Middle East are now Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates,
Right.
and they are aligned against Iran. And there's basically kind of a Cold War taking place over who's going to assert hegemony in the Middle East. And Obama kind of stayed in the middle and didn't want to side with one or the other wisely, as you suggested. And you have obviously hardcore pro-Israel fanatics in the White House, along with, Trump's just natural admiration for regimes like Saudi Arabia, which has pushed him more and more as kind of more moderated people on these questions have been eliminated into the camp of just siding as hardcore as possible with Netanyahu and the Saudi regime, which means being more confrontational with Iran, on top of which it kind of plays into Trump's self-perception that he's a better negotiator than Obama, and it was just a bad deal, like just a bad contract, and he's going to get a better one. So I agree with you that I don't think it means war. I don't think that Trump is committed to war. I don't think anyone in the U.S. political structure wants war, except for like the super crazies, which unfortunately now include his national security advisor.
Right, I was going to say the super crazies are rising. I mean, right, yeah.
Right, but there's a lot of permanent power factions in Washington that exert a lot of power, and to rev up the entire war machine, I think is going to, against Iran, is going to be a really hard pull for a president who doesn't have that much popularity and is opposed by a lot of those factions in Washington. But once you start playing games with that kind of stuff, war can happen a lot without intentionality in the beginning. And it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. You already see Israel killing 8 Iranians in Syria earlier this morning, and the Iranians threatening to, if they haven't already, retaliate against the people they think are responsible. So you're really, pouring gasoline on what already is kind of always a burning flame in the Middle East. And you're right, the fact that the hardcore crazies are most closely now in Trump's ear, at least when it comes to Iran and Israel and Saudi Arabia, is genuinely alarming.
Yeah, and I would just add 2 things just to bracket in that really briefly. I mean, one, I think to your point on some of the more sort of permanent establishment types, I think, and this is speaking from an Israeli perspective, because there is there's always a contingent in Israel that is more managerial and more rational. It doesn't mean, obviously, that they have better policies with regards to things like the occupation or the siege on Gaza. But Ehud Olmert, who, would be like the sort of opposite pole of Netanyahu, was at the Jerusalem Post conference last week. And he was basically just saying, look, what I did in Syria in 2007, where I blew up 1 reactor, and we did it, very quietly, and we actually even did it in such a way where the Syrians didn't even need to respond because they had sort of plausible deniability if they wanted to. This is nothing like us attacking Iran. So he was basically just saying, I hope that, everybody recognizes, particularly Netanyahu, that this means something entirely different, and it would be extremely, he wasn't putting a value judgment on it, but he was saying this is going to be really hard. So that kind of reflects that sentiment. But conversely, I would also be, these never Trump types. I mean, Bill Kristol, David Frum, all of these types of horrible characters have built their careers on instigating for wars and, fear mongering about Iran. And, I don't know. I mean, they've sort of built their brands on being concerned about Trump, but now it's like, it's interfacing with their really hawkish and disastrous policy desires.
Yeah, it's been interesting that I think Bill Kristol has been pretty silent about the Iran deal violation, at least since I've seen him. And David Frum kind of wrote this very, characteristically weaselly article saying, I don't like the Iran deal, but I don't really trust Trump to do much of anything. And I oppose pretty much anything, just kind of playing into his resistance credentials and base now. But at the same time, they're really not worked up about it at all because, of course, they support greater confrontation with Iran. In part because they're loyalist to Israel, and in part because they've always supported militarism and policies that are likely to lead to war. So, I think but I still think that I think in Israel, this managerial class is kind of dying out in favor of this new generation, which which regards even Netanyahu and AIPAC as kind of liberals.
Soft.
Yeah,
they're real soft.
They're scary, that new generation. But there is still this managerial class, of which like General Mattis at the Pentagon is a part, and others who are kind of protective, at least to a reasonable degree, over just starting wars, like real wars, not like, you know, an invasion of Panama, but like real wars like Iran would be,
right,
and risking thousands of the lives of the members of the U.S. military in a way that I think it would be an impediment to overcome, which isn't to say that it's insurmountable, but I think that that's a real barrier. I mean, I don't think, you know, much like they got rid of Michael Flynn, I don't think John Bolton is omnipotent. And so I think, you know, I think there's going to be some inter-Washington kind of jockeying if that becomes a possibility.
Well, from your lips to Allah's ears, final question, and of course I do mean Allah on this show. Final question. You know, you mentioned earlier about the lack of criminal accountability for things like global torture regime, the financial crisis, and Gina Haspel. I mean, nothing more, you know, just tee off.
So, you know, I never had any hope that she was going to be defeated. I've been writing about these issues exactly for 12 years. And early on, I used to think that the Democrats were going to stop some extremist Bush Cheney nominee or some particularly hideous piece of legislation. And at the last minute, they always get enough Democrats defecting to make sure that it all passes so that they never have any blood on their hands in terms of people being able to say they stopped something important for terrorism.
Right.
So I knew there was no way they were going to stop it. Of course, she's going to get confirmed in the fact that Democratic Party national security gurus like John Brennan and Leon Panetta and James Clapper, you know, all came out and plenty more saying that she should be confirmed, you know, was kind of the nail in the coffin for anyone who didn't have any hopes. It does remind me, and I wrote about this earlier this week, I remember during the Israeli election when people thought that Netanyahu might lose because of polls that showed that. I remember a lot of my friends who are Palestinian activists saying, we don't want Netanyahu to lose. We want him to win because it's actually more helpful and more clarifying to have him rather than some prettier, more palatable figure heading Israel, you know, with nicer rhetoric, but doing the same stuff.
Right.
It's better to have the face revealed. And that's kind of how I feel about having somebody that everyone knows actually tortured people as the
she
head of the
literally
CIA.
personally tortured. I mean, I can't underline that enough. It's like she literally personally did it.
There was some retractions from ProPublica about the extent to which she physically was involved, but she certainly was present for.
Right.
And it wasn't just waterboarding; it extended way beyond that. The use of coffins and, you know, mock executions and things that people have gone to prison as war criminals for a very long time. She personally supervised and internally agitated for their continuation. So to kind of take her and put her at the head of the CIA, I think is very revealing, not only about the actual character of that agency, but also all of official Washington that is, you know, with the exception of a handful of Democratic lawmakers, you know, probably the majority of them will vote no. But you know, official Washington is essentially perfectly happy with Gina Haspel, and I think it speaks volumes about them as well, and it makes the work of people like you and me much easier in terms of making those arguments.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only thing that I mean, other than Netanyahu not being pretty, I think you're totally on target.
That's subjective.
Yeah, no, that's not subjective. He's not. You're correct. I'm just being uncooperative. Glenn Greenwald, it was really a great pleasure having you on. I hope we can have you on again sometime soon and continue following up with all of this, but particularly Marielle Franco and Brazil.
Yeah, I've become, you know, a fan of your show. I've seen a bunch of segments you've done within the last few months, and they're always very high quality and thought provoking. So I'm happy to come back anytime.
Oh, I'm really honored. Thank you so much,
right.
Glenn
Thank
Greenwald.
you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. Here's what we're going to do. We have a brief Gulag segment. Then the august. Well, I guess she's not honorable yet because she hasn't been elected yet. Are you honorable until you're elected, or can you be honorable before? I'm not honorable. You're not honorable. That's this really clear self-branding there. She's
dishonorable
like, no.
Julia.
Yeah, the dishonorable Julia Salazar will be with us for her dishonorable campaign. I love it. All right. Do we have the Soviet? This is actually, that's good branding for your campaign. Before we talk about your socialist run, we're going to do a segment where we play the Soviet national anthem and theoretically put somebody in a gulag as a joke. But I think people will know that in this segment, I'm really not joking. If I could put this person in a gulag, I would. Bari Weiss. whose relentless mediocrity is only exceeded by her mendacity. She has a piece out called Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web. Now, obviously, we're going to cover this a lot more. But the long and short of it is that Bari Weiss met with a handful of writers and intellectuals who, like, I don't even know what the appropriate analogy would be. It would almost be like, the rapper would never do this because rappers will always brag about their record sales. But it's like if Migos were like, we're multi-platinum, but nobody downloads our records. Nobody downloads our records, and no hip-hop magazines, no one covers us. We're never on Viceland. Never. And they're on every single fucking day. Like the intellectual dark web of Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and Dave Rubin are the most inescapable hidden thing I've ever encountered in my life.
I have some dark web sound.
It's a dark web sound. So basically, it's a group of aggrieved, mediocre writers who play with ideas that either are actually not controversial or attempt to sort of re-smuggle in discredited racism, as an example, and then sort of just sit on each other's platforms and whine endlessly about never having a chance to speak. Well, apparently groups of like gender studies professors, whose incidentally none of us have ever heard of and will never get written about in the New York Times, suppress their free speech. And Bari Weiss, who got her start in political activism by trying to get professors at Columbia fired who criticized Israel, and has built her career, and apparently not super into free exchange of ideas around Israel, has built her whole sort of tenor at the New York Times with just all these types of pieces. You just can't say what you think anymore, man.
Making a safe space for racism.
Making a safe space for racism. And so the only part of the piece that I found funny, we will pick it apart more, is that she clearly chose to use Dave Rubin, because he's such an idiot, as the sort of patsy for her to be like, see, I'm not totally seduced by these guys, because Dave Rubin gives softball interviews with people that even I would admit are deranged racists. So that's kind of funny. But basically, these guys are going to be the official intellectual court advisors of Peter Thiel's fascist Silicon Valley Republic. And when they're not sort of implementing the new eugenics and algorithm systems to demonetize videos that support a minimum wage or something, they're going to spend the rest of their time even then saying that they never get a fair hearing. And Bari Weiss will be right on their coattails as another soft alt-right mediocrity. So she is sentenced to the Gulag. Unfortunately, I'm sure we'll have to deal with her a lot more. Matt, I can't actually read your tweet because there's a pillar in front of it.
Yeah, we'll sort that out. But I tweeted out a couple nights ago.
Yeah,
it was actually
ahead.
after the last TMBS. But all guys like Sam Harris, Rubin, and Peterson want is for justice movements to hold on in case / until someone can think of arguments to justify current power relations.
Right.
They're running out the clock. That's what
all
they're
of it
doing,
is.
right?
Yeah.
I don't know if they consciously know that they're doing it, but that's what this let's just talk about ideas. My next tweet was, you'd be obsessed with ideas too if you desperately needed some to justify privilege in an increasingly skeptical world. That's the game.
Yeah, they're just renaturalizing hierarchies and capital. That's it.
Can we just talk for 1 second about that horrible dark tiki photo shoot that they did?
Thank you. I would really appreciate that, because I was hoping, I was going to say no unless you're going personal, but I feel like you are going personal, so yes, go for it. Get in on it.
I mean, there's no, I think out of any beach photo shoot of all time, you couldn't have found a group of uglier, stranger looking guys.
Sort of ponderous schmoes staring off into cactus trees while they contemplate the fact that you can't calmly contemplate the genetic inferiority of Hispanic people in public anymore, except you can.
Griscom, you got to find this. I'm not seeing.
We'll come back to it in the post game. We'll come back to it in the post game. That's very post game worthy. So, Bari Weiss, in the Gulag. And I know that all of us here, including, of course, Julia, is committed to that goal. I'm just kidding. We're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to be back with Julia Salazar on The Michael Brooks Show. welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Julia Salazar. She is a state Senate candidate, DSA certified in the 18th District in New York City. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
So you just what was your path to socialism, to organizing, and then take us through that to this decision to run?
Definitely. My path to socialism and organizing began when I was pretty young. I was raised in a working class household. My family immigrated to the U.S. from Colombia, and I was raised by a single mother.
You raised in New York? Or
I was raised actually in South Florida.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but my parents met in New York and then moved back to Colombia to get married, and shortly after my brother and I were born, and my mom raised my brother and I in South Florida, but that was challenging for her. She didn't have a college degree, and worked really hard to fully support my brother and I. And when I was 14 years old, I got my first job bagging groceries at a local grocery store. I worked in the service industry through when I was in high school, and was very lucky to be able to go to New York for college. And that's how I ended up here about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And organizing for me was partly a means of survival, a response to my material circumstances. When I moved to New York, I became a domestic worker. I was a nanny for a family. I cleaned houses. I also received a federal work-study grant, so I simultaneously needed to work on campus.
Right.
So my situation was different from many of my peers. I was going to Columbia, the other Columbia.
Did you ever meet Bari Weiss?
No, I never met. I never met Bari Weiss.
All right. So it wasn't all difficult.
Yeah. No. Yeah. There were some good moments. And
not meeting Bari Weiss.
Like not meeting Bari Weiss, or debating with Bari Weiss. I had a different class experience than a lot of my peers, and through that gained class consciousness. The environment I grew up in was kind of politically conservative, actually. So when I
in Florida, gotcha.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and even just my immediate family, sort of like bootstraps mentality.
Yeah.
And I became familiar with socialism in college, and it completely made sense to me.
Do you remember what the class was specifically, or like when you had your socialism is poppin' moment?
Yeah, my socialism.
That's actually a pretty good new segment. When was your socialism was poppin' moment?
Yeah. It's like Mark Maron. Like, who are your guys?
Yeah, who are your guys, man? Was it Trotsky? Was it?
Yeah, you could do an entire show based on that. And
yeah,
I think every week you'd have plenty of
I know
people to talk to about that. Yeah, for me, I think initially I'm sure it was reading Marx as like an introduction to theory, but I came to understand socialism as working to create a more caring society.
Yeah.
And striving to achieve what really are rights for people that are currently treated as privileges.
What did and then you became an organizer.
Yeah.
So what kind of organizing did you do?
Yeah. Also started when I immediately after moving to New York. But when I was actually still finishing college, I lived in a building that was owned by or that had a really abusive landlord.
Really?
Yeah.
I totally had not heard stories
yeah,
like that
yeah.
here in
Can
New
you
York.
imagine?
Yeah, I can't imagine. The real estate industry is so
humane,
ethical and humane in New York City. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but it happened to me. And
you know, I have to say, I was with, it's actually a wonderful, a really like a friend, and we were meeting, and I was like, I forget the context, but I was running my mouth, and I was like, you know, obviously I have this structural critique, but even within like standards of market economies, just real estate is the most scumbag industry you could be in. Like, it's so like, I have more respect for arms dealers. Like, I was busting out, and he was like, yeah, my dad was a landlord. And you know, I was like, yeah, but I'm still right.
Yeah.
No offense.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you're in this building.
Yeah.
There's New York real estate scumbaggery.
Yeah. What you just said just reminded me, because the last few years I'll tell you all about the real estate scumbaggery, but I've been working primarily on police accountability campaigns for the last few years, and I've met people who naturally have like very personal relationships with law enforcement officers, and often that's like the awkward conversation that ensues after they realize that I'm pretty devoted to trying to hold the NYPD accountable.
Just not to. Matt's married to a cop.
Great.
So just to not, you know,
unmarried.
Yeah. I like how Matt's biggest takeaway was like, I don't give a fuck about the cop part. I'm not married. Just to be clear.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm less surprised by that these days. But I lived in a building with an abusive landlord. They wouldn't heat the apartment in the winter.
Right. That's actually really quite common here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's remarkably common. Yep. And so I talked to my neighbors and my roommates, and I said, you know, legally we can withhold our rent. We've been trying to communicate with them for a long time, and they refuse to make even the most urgent repairs and heat the apartment. So we're going to have a rent strike. And I think my neighbors were pretty scared. And you know, I kind of fronted like I wasn't, but it's a scary thing to go up against a landlord. But we did, and ultimately we took them to housing court, and we had a victory, which is remarkable. Especially, you know, I'm not an attorney. I was 21 years old when I decided to do this.
Awesome.
You know, it was wonderful that we saw some material benefits from that, but at the same time, we were still being priced out of our neighborhood. And it was actually then that I moved to the 18th district. So that was 4 years ago.
What does the 18th district cover? Like what kind of neighborhood? I mean, people from New York will know, and you could tell us that. And also, like, what kind of neighborhoods are you talking about for people who don't necessarily know New York as well?
Absolutely. North Brooklyn, more generally, specifically about half of Greenpoint, most of Williamsburg, all of Bushwick, where I live, some of northern Bed-Stuy, and Cypress Hills, part of East New York.
Right. So these are very gentrified, or not. I mean, there's some unevenness there, but certainly Williamsburg, definitely Greenpoint to a significant extent, Bed-Stuy to actually a pretty significant extent, Bushwick mostly, Cypress Hills maybe a little bit less, but it's very so. And this is where you could maybe start to kind of maybe talk a little bit about your opponent possibly as well, like because in New York, that sort of, there's this interesting fusion, it seems to me, between like there's all these machine systems that are really complicated and really insulated, and they sort of deliver for people in certain very narrow, constricted ways, and you have to kind of like be in the system. And then there's a lot of like room for people to sort of like, you know, I'm the state rep from wherever, and I'm going to go to this rally and, you know, say Trump is a racist and blah, 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 blah. And then actually the bulk of their legislative agenda is helping real estate interests clean out a neighborhood. So there's a lot of that kind of like talk left, walk right kind of thing. So is that like sort of what you're up against? Like what sort of led to the decision to take your activism up to the kind of tempo of running for office, and who are you dealing with? Who's your opponent?
Yeah. To give some context, my opponent is Martin Dillon, who's been the state senator in the 18th for about 15 years. He's taken an enormous amount of campaign donations from for-profit real estate developers and the real estate lobby, including the Rent Stabilization Association, which, it's similar to a right to work sort of misnomer. Right. It's and really an anti-tenant lobby, of which Jared Kushner sits on the board, and I think Trump previously sat on the board of this organization. And as a Democratic senator, Dillon has accepted donations from them, and that has been evident in the policy that he's supported as a result, which is has been very harmful to the tenants in the district, and has directly resulted in the gentrification that you've described. That means supporting vacancy decontrol, for example, policies that force people out of homes that they've lived in for decades, and contributing to an affordable housing crisis in our district, which is largely what inspired me to run. Hearing constituents and my neighbors talk about this, and feeling really helpless, and also being inspired by the opposition to Dillon that we've seen in the last 4 years that I've lived in the district.
And so you were part of that sort of grassroots activism, and were you continuing to work as a union organizer? Is that right?
Yeah. So I have most recently been working for a community organization that's part of the Communities United for Police Reform coalition, of more than 200 community organizations in New York City that are fighting for police reform and advocating for people who've been harmed systemically and or personally by the NYPD. But I'm also a union member of UAW Local 1981, and have previously worked with UAW Local 2110 to organize academic workers.
Okay, got you. So what made you finally decide to run? And I think also for people, like, there's a lot of people in this community specifically, like even patrons of this show, who are actually kind of connecting with each other. They're generating really interesting sort of local activism initiatives and things like that. We just talked with Lee Carter a couple of months ago, and his like amazing campaign and what he's doing in Virginia. So like, I guess, and one of the things that always interests me in those conversations is definitely like, so what made you finally tip to want to make that? I get like the build up to it, and then logistically, if somebody's thinking about doing this in anywhere, and obviously I know the rules are different depending on where you live, but like, what did it actually look like to, like, when you decide I'm going to run? What does that mean? Like, what are the first phone calls you have to make? Like, kind of give us a sense of that process logistically.
Yeah, it was quite a process. On a daily basis for months, I deliberated, everywhere from being a hard no, I'm not going to run, to yes, let's do this, let's win back our district. It began, you could say, even in 2014. There was a candidate, Debbie Medina, who was a tenant organizer, is a tenant organizer in South Williamsburg, working class, also Latina, who decided to challenge Dillon, and in my opinion ran a very inspiring campaign in 2014 and got 43% of the vote against Dillon in the Democratic primary, running as the Democratic Socialist. And with broad working class support in the district. Debbie ran again in 2016. I canvassed for her. many of us were really excited for her campaign, and ultimately there were serious issues with her campaign, and she wasn't able to successfully campaign in the end. But even without a lot of support toward the end of her campaign and the resources that she would have needed and field strategy, she actually still got more than 40% of the vote. And at the time, which was remarkable to me, against an incumbent, and what I would say is a Democratic machine candidate. So, and as an open socialist. So I think that that indicated to me that our district is unique and uniquely progressive, and uniquely civically engaged right now. And people are really hungry for someone who will actually advocate for them and bring their voices to Albany. And so when I saw that, I thought, I got to find a candidate to run against DeLon. And so I started looking for a candidate to run against DeLon. And it was one of these situations, like, not unlike what Lee Carter actually described, I think, that you're looking for the right person or the right movement, and suddenly you realize, oh, I need to do this. Right. If I want it to happen, I need to do this, so long as I have a team behind me who can make it happen, and the people around me who I actually want to advocate for want this to happen. And I found that was the case.
How have you started to assemble that team and strategy? Yeah.
So I've been an active member of the NYC Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, for about 2 years. And through that have had the opportunity to organize with a lot of really inspiring people. In North Brooklyn specifically, we have more than 800 active members. So that was the first place I looked to try to assemble a team that would be able to make this campaign viable. Yeah. Yeah.
What have you been finding as you've started to talk to people? It makes sense to me. That's definitely also what, Jabari Brisport, who we also did a lot of stuff with. He always said, and it makes total sense, that housing is the issue that even comedically, it's the first wave of gentrifiers are getting priced out in New York now. Right. So that makes sense that's just the preeminent issue. And then policing is obviously, because of your experience and because it's, never not an issue for a lot of communities in New York. Actually a very large part of the population has a radically different experience of policing along race and class lines. So I'm kind of picking on those two issues you've already talked about. Is there anything else that people are bringing to you when you go to them door to door? I know on Saturday, you and I are going to be part of a healthcare panel together. What's on people's minds?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the healthcare panel.
That was a solid plug.
Yeah, that was a great plug.
Right in there.
Yeah, very smooth. So I've been advocating even before this campaign for the New York Health Act. So probably the most important issue, in addition to the other two, is access to quality health care. And that doesn't only mean single payer, but universal long-term care is a component of this that I think is often overlooked, that there are a lot of seniors in our communities, in my district, domestic workers as well, and they need to be considered when we're talking about universal health care. People who deserve to be able to age in dignity at home, in the environment that they choose, rather than potentially being warehoused in nursing homes. And also that when we say that we want everyone to have access to affordable care, that's going to demand a lot of home care jobs for domestic workers, jobs in healthcare, and those need to be quality jobs.
Yeah, definitely. When you look at the state politics, and it's something. It's funny. Like I feel like I know more about what's happening in Brazil and Iran than in New York, which is maybe kind of a problem. But whatever, it is what it is. But we had like Nomiki Kantz on this show, and she talks about the IDC, the Independent Democratic, is it caucus or and the way that they have basically, along obviously with Cuomo being totally complicit, kept the Senate in Republican hands and bottlenecked what could, definitely not be a socialist agenda, but at least a more sort of genuinely liberalish agenda. When you look at your positioning, and I think that this is part of a wave, and it's so obvious in a place like New York City that there should be left candidates challenging all of these people all over the place because it's a one-party city that might signify in a whole bunch of issues. But when it really comes to confronting any of these issues, there's very, very little follow-through. Do you envision a role where, like, obviously not like the IDC because their role is incredibly negative, but at the same time, there was a group of small people who in their case, for like cynical reasons, was able to exert an enormous amount of control of the process. And I'm just wondering, like, is that the game plan for people coming in on like a DSA kind of platform? Like, why couldn't that sort of position be maneuvered where a small group could have a similar disproportionate influence, but for, an actual, for real universal healthcare agenda, policing, affordable housing, universal public housing, why not?
Yeah.
Is that kind of like how how are you conceiving of your role if you actually do go up to Albany, which we're going to make happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I not only think that it's possible, but that there's a greater desire for it, because the IDC, when the IDC was created, it was not because it's what voters wanted. In fact, the voters who elected Democrats, who then caucused with Republicans, were very disappointed and unpleasantly surprised, I think. But we're seeing what I think is a blue wave in New York State of more progressive challengers, whether they're challenging IDC members, which is courageous and needs to happen, or like myself are challenging Democrats in the state Senate who have been ineffective or who have sold out their constituents. Regardless, we have more progressive challengers who I think will be victorious in our races, paired with already elected incumbents in the state Senate who have been unable to be as effective as they could be because of the political dynamic. So I think in 2019 we could see a lot of electeds in Albany unifying to form a caucus that, unlike the IDC, is actually working to build our power within the legislature on behalf of constituents in order to advance progressive policies.
What has your opponent's reaction been like to you so far? Has he responded at all? Have they acknowledged your existence?
Yeah.
Or are you gonna be able to debate him? Like, what do we have to do here?
Yeah. I'm not sure what it will take to get Dylan to...
Maybe we could pretend that we're setting up a meeting with him and a real estate lobbyist.
Yeah.
And then we'll ambush him, and you'll be there, be like, psych, let's debate.
Wow. Yeah, that would be quite the ambush.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I almost made it to Catch a Predator joke. I actually just did.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
That would be fun.
Yeah, that would be fun. I think that would go viral.
Yeah.
Yep.
So far, I have noticed that my opponent, the incumbent, has been making more public appearances and had more speaking engagements in the last few weeks alone. As someone who doesn't really have any robust constituent services, is known to not really spend any time with people in the district.
Why would you want to do that?
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting perhaps promising response that he sees a serious challenger. Otherwise, I haven't directly engaged with him.
Okay. You're going to stick around with us for the post game, and that's when the gloves are really going to come off on everybody. Okay? Yeah, it's going to be vicious. Before we do that, what can people do to get involved in all possible ways with your campaign? How can they help make it happen?
Yeah, I'll make a shameless plug.
Yeah, not only am I actually do shameless plugs really well.
Great.
I'm good at that, so I'm all for it. So we have you, if you're watching on YouTube, here is a link to the website, or this is actually your Twitter, rather.
Sure.
And so just, tell us all the ways, from volunteering to contributions. What can people do?
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. That's a real campaign website you got there.
It's real.
Yeah.
That's
real. You even got like the enthusiastic group of like Julia in the front. I love it.
Yeah.
This is awesome. Dylan, dude, we're coming.
Yeah.
It's about to happen.
Yeah, I'm excited. So as you've pulled up, we have our website is salazarforsenate.com. It's on my Twitter account, the campaign Twitter account. There's
and
a
what
link
are those at?
At Salazar Senate 18 is the campaign account. Mine is Julia Carmel, my middle name, 2 underscores on Twitter. And you can follow a link to volunteer or to contribute on the website. Our canvassing kickoff will be on May 19th in the district.
Okay, canvassing kickoff May 19th. And that's, that's indispensable for the kind of campaign you're running. So if anybody is in the vicinity, go out there and help make that happen. Okay, we're going to go to the post game, where we will just be with patrons who are the best people on the planet. And I want to thank all of you. I want to thank new patrons. And I want to say, yes, the goal is to get to that 2K during August. It will be the year-long anniversary of this show. And I forget the specific date we launched, but I know it was in August. It will also be my birthday. It's going to be a heavy month. So join, make it happen. We appreciate it. The growth has been great. And we want to keep giving you, sustaining, obviously, the content we already have, but continuing to expand out the content. So the new show with Waz, Big Waz and I, it's a brand new thing. It's going to be just for patrons of Count the Dings and just for patrons of TMBS. That's produced by Jade Hoy. Is truly like, he's a fellow super producer, and he's evil. He's an instigator. And Waz and I went deep. Like, Waz and I will talk about what everybody else has talked about, but we are just going to do it better. So we talked about Kanye. We had our eternal Ta-Nehisi Coates argument. And we even, remember that clip, Matt, of that Israeli guy challenging Nate Robinson to one-on-one where in Israel? And he's just like, Nate, I beat you.
I missed that clip.
One-on-one. Nate. Yeah, we talked about that. So there's a lot there, and we're going to do that potentially even 4 times, like maybe once a week, but at least twice a month. That's going to be a new thing just for patrons. This Sunday, it's going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be an illicit history or a primer. We're going to do the kind of broader fallout of Iran, including also like the Kurdish response with Jean Bajlan. So we're going to do a deep dive on that. Obviously, I'm very Iran preoccupied right now. And then we're planning out illicit histories on the financial crisis, on Afghanistan, Pakistan, more stuff on Jamaica, new things on Haiti, and new collaborations with Mike Hanna, and also one on the Chinese labor market. Next week, we have, I believe we have the left, the Justice Democrat challenger to Dianne Feinstein. I think we're having her. And then also Crew, Bhaskar Sankara. He's back for his regular slot. So thank you all so much. Patreon.com/TMBS. I want to thank super producer Matt Leck, head theoretician David Grishcom, super producer David Slavic. We will see you in the post game. We'll take your calls, your Discord questions, your IMs. We'll watch an Alex Jones clip. And Julia's got some savage shit to say that she told me she wasn't willing to say up front. So we're going to get to it.
It's a bonfire of the landlords.
Bonfire of the landlords. All right, everybody. Left is best.